Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the House Environment and Transportation Committee and Senate Education, Energy, and the Environment Committee joint briefing on building energy performance standards. We really appreciate the senators coming over to the House. I hope we didn't spark a constitutional crisis by doing that. Senator, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you have any opening comments you want to make.
Yeah, well, I just want to thank my good friend from the neighboring legislative district, Chair Corman, for the invite and for hosting. I will only just say that we had Secretary McElwain in our committee yesterday for a broad briefing on the climate, the pollution reduction plan. And last week we did have Director Pinsky in for a broad overview. But this particular topic we're taking up today, I do think is important. We've got some regs pending in ALR. And so I think it's worthy of extra attention, this specific sub part of what we heard from Director Pinsky last week and Secretary McElwain yesterday. So with that, I'll yield back to you, Mr. Chair.
Terrific. Thank you, Chair Feldman. We'll bring up our first panel, which is the Secretary and the Administrator and whoever from their team they would like up with them. Colleagues, we will do Q&A after each panel. So we have 3 panels. We'll do Q&A at the end of each panel. And for our Senate colleagues, we can just swap out seats if any of you have questions who don't have a seat around the horseshoe at the moment. With that, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Administrator, welcome and please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Chair Feldman and Vice Chair Kagan, Chair Corman. So good, and Vice Chair Boyce. It's so good to see you all again. We've been spending a lot of time together over the last 2 days. It's great. And also good morning to all the members of the Education, Energy, and Environment Committee and the Environment and Transportation Committee. For the record, I am Serena McElwain, Secretary of Maryland's Department of the Environment. Thank you so much for inviting me and my team here to present on MDE's role in implementing the building energy performance standards. And also, I chaired and we co-chaired the Building Energy Transition Implementation Task Force. Joining me from MDE is our Air and Radiation Director, Chris Hoagland, who's the brain behind all of this. Yep, I just set you up. And then we also have Director Pinsky, Director of Maryland's Energy Administration, who was also the co-chair, as I said, on the Energy Transition Implementation Task Force. And as you all probably know, he was also the lead sponsor on the Climate Solutions Now Act. So I'm really grateful to have your partnership and just able to talk to you all today. So I'm going to get right into it. So I do plan to turn things over to Director Pinsky in a few seconds just to talk about how the Climate Solutions Now Act, how that relates to BEPS. And I'd like to also highlight that MDE, we are required as part of the Climate Solutions Now Act to establish the building energy performance standards. We are not only we're not the only ones, just for context, who are implementing building standards. And I just thought I'd give a little flavor on that. There are other states who are doing it as well. And the White House is also supporting these types of programs through the National Building Performance Standards Coalition. So the goal of BEPS is to reduce emissions from buildings by encouraging the collection or benchmarking of data and ultimately driving energy efficiency and lowering levels of greenhouse gas emissions. Today, I will share with you our progress on adopting BEPS, as well as we're going to highlight the major recommendations that came out of the Building Energy Transition Implementation Task Force. So as I stated before, I'm going to turn it over to you, Director Pinsky, so you can give a little insight on the Climate Solutions Now Act and how it relates to BEPS.
Great. Thank you, Madam Secretary, and to the chairman and the 2 committees. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's great to be in front of the Montgomery Mafia. Just kidding. Want to lighten the atmosphere. Many of you voted 22 months ago for the Climate Solutions Now Act. Obviously, the legislature passed it. It went to the governor, who neither assigned it nor vetoed it, and it became law of the land. The headlines to many people were the reduction mandates, 60% reduction by 2031, and net zero by 2045. They captured some of the headlines locally and nationally, but as many of you recall, it was an omnibus bill. It did many other things. I think, I don't want to say first and foremost, but a very important foundation was institutionalizing a Justice 40 lens in the work we do going forward in terms of making those reductions. That we can't be blind to the last 20, 40, 100 years of the communities that have been ignored and overburdened and underserved. So that is clearly a key part of the bill. And many folks in the House, thank you, Vice Chair Boyce, for your work on that. We set up a green bank. We worked to electrify the state's fleet. And also we talked about decarbonizing large buildings, which is a segue into today's work. While many of the mandates and goals and policies were 20,000 feet, 15,000 feet, we also included some very concrete actions. And one of those concrete actions was to say large buildings, those buildings over 35,000 square feet, had to reduce their carbon emissions by 20% by 2030. Very specific, very concrete. And part of the reason, all the scientists tell us early action is the most important action, because you get those reductions for more years, and it's very important. So we had that very concrete step in the law. Now, we also understood that the transition to doing that would not be easy. So another aspect of the bill was setting up the task force to actually help in that transition of the BEPS, which the Secretary and I co-chaired. So that's sort of what brings us here today in terms of that report and the work that went into it and the recommendation. So with that, I will pass it back to the Secretary.
Thank you so much for that context. Okay, we're going to get started. So you might be wondering what type of buildings are included under BEPS. The law defined a covered building as a building in Maryland that has a gross floor area of 35,000 square footage of space or more, excluding the parking garage area. Exempt buildings include buildings that are smaller than 35,000 square feet, historic buildings, public and non-public elementary schools and secondary school buildings, manufacturing buildings and agricultural buildings as well. So here you can see on the slide a few examples of buildings that would be covered. You see the Walmart store, a multi-family apartment. There's a warehouse. In this picture, you can also see a little small green box. That one would not be covered because it's under 31,000 square footage of space. My agency estimates that there will be roughly or about 9,000 covered buildings that would need to comply with BEPS. The most common type of that 9,000 figure are warehouses, basically. And that follows, you can see that on the chart as well, large residential buildings and office buildings and retail. There are 9,000 buildings. These 9,000 buildings that we're talking about are in every part of the state. Every county has at least one building that's covered by BEPS. Some have more, but as you can see on this map, well, you really can't tell on the map, but I'm telling you, the covered buildings, they are concentrated in the urban areas and along major interstate highways. So the next slide, this one shows how BEPS will start phasing in over time. If you look in the first column, you'll see the benchmarking begins actually in 2025. This is the collection of data to establish a baseline and track progress. In our BEPS law, the covered buildings will be required to begin that benchmarking and analyzing energy use and greenhouse gas emissions annually by 2025. By 2030, the covered buildings will be required to either achieve the energy and emission standards or use alternative compliance provisions. So if a building owner does not meet the standards, they will have to pay a fee or a penalty. But those fees and penalties, they do not apply until 2030. So we would not be actually collecting fees until 2031. There are two standards that take effect in 2030. So by law, BEPS includes both net direct greenhouse gas emission standards, known as emission standards, and also site energy use intensity standards, which is EUI standards. These standards give businesses, building owners, developers, and engineers certainty about the pace of decarbonization. So here I'd like to point out in this slide that we really did collaborate nationally. We worked with key national laboratories and federal agencies. We worked very closely with the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and a whole lot of other ones. I mentioned Berkeley Lab. So they're the ones who actually calculated the energy and emissions reductions that we can expect from BEPS. And they also found that significant energy savings actually can be achieved. And also they have both site UEI as well as direct emission targets. So I'd like to highlight the importance of the EUI standards. With those standards, we will be able to do enough electrification to meet the greenhouse gas standards by managing the new energy demand. I just spoke about Berkeley's lab. So Berkeley Labs, they also estimate for energy and emission reductions, but they also conducted a cost benefit analysis. That analysis looked at the building stock as a whole with average costs across the entire stock. And they found that the energy savings outweighed those costs over time. Okay, next slide. So this is my last slide before I turn it over to you, Director Pensky. So now that we've covered BEPS and the associated benefits, I'd like to just touch really quickly on the regulatory process itself. The proposed regulation is the result of many months of assistance from our partners and stakeholders, the outreach that we did. So my agency held 14 stakeholder meetings for public input on draft regulations through the fall of 2022. And we also completed a draft regulation in March of 2023. We shared a draft of the BEPS regulation for stakeholder feedback in May through June of 2023. And we updated the regulation and supporting documentation based on the feedback that we received. On December 15th, 2023, the Maryland Register posted our proposed regulations. On January 18th, just a week ago, we held another public hearing and closed the collection of public comments on those proposed regulations. Now we're targeting a final effective regulation by May 2024. So as we move forward, MDE will continue to provide technical guidance to stakeholders that are actually required to comply with those regulations. We're also working with Governor Moore's federal investment team to pursue more federal funding to help the buildings comply, because that's really important. And we're also collaborating between agencies, including incorporating decarbonization priorities in our climate pollution reduction grant. So now I'm going to hand it over to you, Director Pensky, so you can talk about the task force that we chaired.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And before we do that, if we could go back to slide 10, the cost benefit. Yeah, you know, because of time, the Secretary went quickly because she doesn't want to take up too much of your time. This is a very important slide. This was not done by advocates. It wasn't done by my agency or the Secretary's agency. It was done by an independent body that put together a modeling exercise. And it's very important to look at the so-called bottom line, that over time, there are savings, energy savings to the industry and to our society. So that's very important. I don't want that lost in the many slides you're going to see today. So
can I just make a comment on that?
Yes.
And I think also with anything, there are upfront costs, right? So for example, if you have to build a building, you build the building once, and that's a lot of money. But going forward, the costs are much less. And in this case, there are so many savings from that example of building a building, that it outweighs the upfront cost.
Great. Thank you. Let's go back to the transition task force. Okay, as I mentioned, the task force was called for in the Climate Solutions Now Act that the legislature passed 2 years ago. Among its charges, I'm not going to read through these, is to include incentives to electrify projects that would not otherwise result in strong returns. So that was one of the areas to save money for owners of large buildings and to try to figure out what incentives would be helpful in making this transition. The task force was made up of a diverse group of 24, 25 from multiple agencies, from the building community to architects to labor. It was a very mix and match of broad stakeholders. Next slide, please. We were originally told to finish our report by the end of December. And I will tell you that in mid-December or maybe early December, the secretary and I received a letter. I think it also went to the governor from 5 of the stakeholders and 5 of the members of the task force who said they felt their message, their concerns weren't being heard. Essentially, I'm bringing this down to, and they said, we think we're dissatisfied if we finish now. So we huddled, we talked to them, we met with them, I think remotely, and then we decided that out of respect and the importance of including their perspectives, that we would add additional meetings so they could vocalize and try to win over the task force to some of the recommendations. So that's why it's late. I believe you received it yesterday. Our last meeting was, I don't know, January 9th, January 7th, whatever. But we extended it beyond what the law called for. And I will tell you this, that the final vote was 16 in favor of the report that you received, 5 against, 1 abstention, and a couple who were absent that day. So it was 16-5-1. And I don't have it in front of you, but I believe the 5 voted against it were the same 5 who sent that letter to Secretary McElwain and myself and the governor. Okay, let's get to the recommendations. And again, I'm going to be very brief here. They are explained in more detail in the report itself, which hopefully you have hard copy or electronic copy in front of you. And again, I'm not going to read them. The first one is the importance of workforce development. We want a working body of people across our state who can do the work to make sure this happens, who are prepared and trained through apprenticeships and other areas as well. So that's clearly one of these. Second one I want to take a moment on, and that's, a one-stop shop. We don't want this to be a bureaucratic nightmare. I mean, we want to make this easy and as efficient as possible. We don't want, whether it's residents, whether it's a building community, to say, well, we had to go through A, through B, through C, then they send us back to A. We want to minimize that as much as possible. And the other aspect of this second recommendation is the whole home approach. And that's very important. And this was new to me too, as well. And I want to thank Ruth Ann Norton and others who educated me on this. She wasn't alone. But if you put a heat pump into a home or to a building, but you haven't done the energy efficiency, you're like wasting your time. And the idea of whole home is to do many of these aspects at once. So in other words, you're not making a bad investment. You know, so if a home, multifamily, apartment building, whatever, hasn't had the energy efficiency, the windows, the insulation, whatever, and then you put other infrastructure in, we're just wasting our time and the state's money or private money. So that's very important of number 2. Number 3, the Clean Energy Hub. In the legislation this legislature passed 2 years ago, it created an energy hub. It called for one position, one pin, and that person is actually here and is ready to answer any questions. And that's to be a clearinghouse. The idea in the hub was to have an office. We didn't think it would stay at one person, who would work with the built community, the experts, the people who service, the contractors, the scientists, and try to coordinate and make this, again, as efficient and effective as possible with minimizing having to go through bureaucracy. So the hub would be a clearinghouse with expertise. And if she or the person at the hub didn't have it, could say directly, contact A or contact X or whatever. So very important. And the task force recommended we expand that by, I don't know, 5 or 10 or 20 positions. I understand we would love them at MEA, but we also know the budget is going through a tight situation. Okay, the fourth one is funding for the building energy section transition. And I know the EEE committee got this report yesterday with a number of recommendations, including a cap and invest, a green bond, some fees. It's going to take some money. You know, we're going to have to figure out where that money comes from. So that is clearly one of the recommendations. And again, the task force didn't focus on one and said, this is the one going forward, but it acknowledged the need for revenue to put some of these mechanisms in place. The fifth one has been a little controversial, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I'm sure some of you are saying, what the heck does Medicaid have to do with transforming our buildings to be energy performance standards? Well, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonizing is obviously important in terms of addressing climate change. But we also know independently, indoor air quality, asthma, and a lot of other things are part of the health concern that we address. And there's been some talk that it's possible to access some of the Medicaid money in some of our work to clean up buildings and make them more energy efficient and decarbonizing. Because at the same time,
Unused.
yeah, unused money in some cases, that they're dual benefits. So look, it has been done on a wide scale across the nation, not yet, but it's been brought up. We want to put it on the table as something to look at and to consider. Okay, next slide, and I'll finish up, and this will be near the end of our presentation. Let me go here. Let me go to second bullet. I mean, the first bullet on this page talks about on-bill repayment and some efficiencies for utilities in the built community to make this transition a little easier. The second one I want to take a moment to look at. And the task force recommended shifting where we're investing money currently towards electrification. One issue that some of you have dealt with is STRIDE. Clearly, the task force understands when there's a crisis, when there are leaks, when people's lives are in danger, every action has to be done to replace those pipes, correct those pipes, et cetera. But there was concern voiced by multiple people on the task force of doing widespread investment in pipes and replacing pipes that in 10 or 15 or 20 years may not be used, might not be the wisest area to invest our money in. And that we should start to shift and think in our heads, is this a long-term investment? And could it be better used towards the electrification and towards the transition in our large buildings and eventually buildings of other sizes beneath the 35,000 square feet. Tax incentives, that will probably come up from speakers behind us. A list was given to us early, a long list that was not explained as well as we would think. There are a lot of complications when you talk about changing tax code. We list 5 or 10 or 12 to be considered, but we didn't have the capacity generally, or was full explanation offered that we felt comfortable adopting specific tax incentives. Some states and some locales have moved forward on these. We reference them in the report. I believe New York State and a couple of other locales have done that. And finally, and this gets back to the Justice 40, which should go through all of these, but in transitioning to large buildings, and we can think about multifamily homes that may be housing working and poor people, low and moderate income people, how do we cover the projected cost if there are upfront projected costs that fall on the shoulders of these people? And that cannot be ignored. It's got to be part and parcel of any recommendation. And finally, the last bullet on the screen is about support BEPS compliance. As we said earlier, early adopters are the best adopters. You can't recapture time lost. You know, we have to do this by 2030 and then 2045. And that, you know, we all get older, the months flip on the cartoons, and we can't recapture that. We can't waste any time in doing this, you know, unless we think the law was wrong. You know, and the Climate Solutions Now Act was very explicit in its mandates. The governor himself separately has called for 100% clean energy, which goes somewhat hand in hand with this by 2035. So we think there is an urgency, but it's got to be done in a thoughtful manner as we transition for the large buildings.
Great. Thank you, Madam Secretary and Mr. Director. I apologize for calling you administrator before Director Pinsky, but it's a miracle I didn't call you senator. So
Just not late for dinner.
or Mr. Chair. Before I open it up to my colleagues, I just do have a quick question about the recommendations. There's 10 recommendations. Are some of these ones that the two of you, being in your positions, can implement immediately on your own, or do all of these require either budgetary resources or legislation?
Chris, why don't I turn it over to you? Which,
Certainly incentives require budget or legislation. And the primary focus was on incentives and funding. So most of these recommendations are ways to mobilize resources to help the industry comply with the regulations and the broader goals of the Climate Solutions Now Act.
Yeah, it's a mix and match if I could. You know, they're recommending expanding the hub position with, I can't remember how much more money, $500,000. There was some number,
Yeah.
and that's a budgetary issue as well. Look, the issue of stride has been an issue before this legislature. That's a policy decision. You know, obviously it has implications for the utility sector. So I think some of these are policy, some of these are financial.
I think that last one was the Commission on Climate Change, not the BEPS report. But on the 10 in the BEPS report, I just want to make sure I'm clear that none of them can be done sort of through executive action by you all. You're looking to, I guess, the legislature for bills, for resources.
yep, that would be a true response. Yeah.
Okay, and
Yes.
is there legislation coming from the administration to implement the task force recommendations you just presented?
Not at this time.
And I know you had a little bit of this yesterday in the Senate. I wasn't there, so I just want to make sure I understand. In the budget, does it have resources for these recommendations?
Not at this time.
Okay.
That's why I'm happy we're having these conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, again, the report came out yesterday.
Mhm.
The governor's budget has been worked on for numbers of months, as you know, from your budget work. So it didn't align in terms of the calendar.
Other questions, Mr. Chairman?
Just back, this is for you, Director Pinsky, just on this topic of money. I'm a little intrigued because I had not, this idea of unused Medicaid money, because you said it's been talked about, you know, how real is that? Or is that just sort of a theoretical possibility? Or have you actually gotten some concrete feedback from the feds that this is, I'm kind of interested in that very specific item. Because I've not heard of that as even in the realm of possibility before.
I had not either when it first came up in October, November.
I think there's some more information in the report. I think it's an idea that we need to keep chewing on. It is a novel concept, and I think the task force was in the position of not turning away ideas generally. And so if there's one, even if it needs more chewing to figure it out, we should get that conversation started.
Okay, well, as you do the chewing, keep the two committees up to speed on the chewing processes. I'll yield back to you, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Baker.
Don't touch. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of questions. You've provided a lot of information on fees, tonnage. I have no idea how much tonnage of carbon dioxide and so forth that's going to be emitted into the air from these warehouses and such that you just talked about. Do you have a chart as to what that really means, or what that really means in real dollars? I mean, I have no idea. You tell me, you mentioned warehouses. So what's that cost impact for an average size warehouse?
We have
And,
so-
and you don't have to provide it now, but I would like to have some information on that so that when you talk about fees, cost, I would have something I could honestly relate it in my head.
Yeah, if I could be, you may or may not have an answer, Chris, on that. It's my understanding, and I'm not far from an expert in this, that this will ultimately be done by sector within the building community. So in other words, apartment buildings, commercial buildings, warehouses, and there will be benchmarking of what their average emissions are. And it's also my understanding that companies that have taken steps will get credit for those steps. So in other words, if
I
after
understand all of that, but I don't know what a ton means. I know what a ton, in weight, but I don't know what that means when you're releasing a ton of emissions into the air.
Why don't you try to answer that?
Sure. So there were some graphs in the presentation and we'd be happy to
Okay.
follow up with more information.
Okay.
The buildings covered by this regulation are responsible for several million tons of carbon dioxide every year. And in terms of the costs, the overall estimates that we showed on the screen were that there would be eventually $4.5 billion in savings through 2050. As you weigh the overall savings, which were in the neighborhood of 22 billion, against the costs, which were in the neighborhood of
Yeah, but that doesn't help me
of
on
about 14
how much
billion
it's going to cost. Average cost per square
Per square foot.
or something. like that.
Certainly, and we can follow up. We have that information as well. Yeah,
Okay, and
it
then the other
translates
question I
roughly to.
have, why are government buildings exempt?
The law exempted several categories, including schools but generally, state government buildings that don't fall into one of the functional categories are not exempt. They are subject to the regulation.
Okay, thank you.
We're gonna let Chair Corman recognize the questioners, but I want the honor because she's from the best legislative district, state of Maryland, the 15th legislative district. Delegate Foley, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Feldman. My question is, well, first of all, let me just say that on the issue of Medicaid funding, I'm concerned about taking money that is, directed to underserved communities and poor people, and now directing that to pay for other things for poor people. So I'm a little concerned about that, but I'd like to see more on that issue. But my question is, so the funds for low and moderate income housing, my understanding of the IRA is that there's quite a bit of money there for something like that. Am I right about that? Is that a potential pot of money for us to be able to fund that? Because we're looking at a whole housing package now from the governor. We're gonna have to take all of this into consideration, right? So I just wanted to get some feedback on that. Thank you.
Well,
Go ahead.
in terms of the IRA and the homes in HERA, it's 136 or $136.5 million over 4 or 5 years. And some of that is electrification, some is replacement of gas and oil, whether it be refrigerators, whatever it might be. So some of that money may be overlapping and we can use it, but if half of it is for the project and it's over 4 years, I don't want to say $20 million, not a lot of money. It's significant, but hopefully as that money comes in, and we don't know when it's coming in, we thought it was going to come in the spring. Now it looks like late summer. We don't know. It has to be released from the feds. We will use it as appropriate to move working poor families, low and moderate income families in that direction. So hopefully it's going to follow those same principles and be a help, but it's a little hard to quantify at this point how much of it will be.
Okay, thank you. And just to be clear, that's 136 million for over the whole span of time for the state overall.
Well, that's the home in HERA.
Home. Okay.
Home and electrification.
I got it. Okay.
And half is clearly explicitly in the federal law to go to low and moderate income. So
Okay. Okay, great.
that's where it's going. And we are committed, like I said earlier, that we are using a Justice 40 lens in everything we do.
Right.
So I expect it'll be more than 50% will be going to those working poor families who have been ignored.
Thank you, and thank you both for the presentation.
Thank you.
Delegate Foley, Senator Hester.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Hello, Secretary. I had two questions just following on the funding stream. My first was that on one of the slides, you mentioned that MDE is working with Governor Moore's federal investment team. And I was just curious if there was enough people looking for grants that we're not leaving any federal money on the table, or could it be possible that with this and some of the other climate pollution reduction plans, we might need more grant writers? My second question was, it's my understanding that there's $90 million in the Strategic Energy Investment Fund's dedicated purpose account to fund the state's climate pollution reduction plan. Now, is this not part of the climate reduction plan?
Chris, if you can answer those two technicals, the first one.
So for the first one, yes, there are so many different federal programs to apply for. We and the other agencies and the governor's office are working to get as many applications in as possible. One of those grants at MDE is a climate planning grant from EPA that we received that we're using to staff up and hire more people to implement climate planning, and that includes applying for more grants. So we are staffing up in that regard to make sure that we make maximum use of all of those opportunities. And there are many that are relevant here. The IRA increased the tax credit. This isn't anything we'd have to apply for. It increased the 179D tax credit for commercial buildings to implement energy efficiency upgrades. But then there are lots of competitive grants that we could potentially put toward this purpose. And then for your second question, yes, this is one of the key elements of the climate plan, decarbonizing large buildings through BEPS and through other means. So we agree that this is a priority area to invest going forward.
Do you have a follow-up?
The chair just asked you all if any of these recommendations were funded. And you said this was part of the climate pollution prevention plan. There's $90 million in the budget. So could we get some clarification on whether any of these things are in that $90 million?
We can do that. I can get you that information. That's still being worked out where that funding is going to. So yeah, we have to get back with you on that. Okay.
Delegate Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also want to first off thank the Speaker's office for allowing me to serve on this task force. Thank you, Director and Madam Secretary. If any of you ever have the opportunity to get onto the task force meetings, they really get deep into the woods, and it really is very, very informative. So I encourage anyone to get on the task force meetings. They're very, very informative. My question is relevant to, obviously there's a lot of questions about funding. The fines and fees for the owners that don't take care of these, the 35,000 square foot and over, where does that money go to?
You want to talk about where the funding goes to, which pot of money we have? And
Sure.
okay.
The Climate Solutions Now Act did not specify where that funding would go. The good news is that it's 7 years before any of that would be collected. So there's certainly time to firm that up. As currently written, it would go to the department like any other permit fee. But I believe we've communicated that at some point in the next 7 budgets, we should all clarify exactly where those proceeds would go and how they could be invested, for example, to help buildings comply with the regulations.
And I would encourage to make sure that we put these back into a program that does exactly what the task force and the systems are suggested to do. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Holmes. Delegate Love.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone, or I guess we're still morning. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here and thanks for all of this information. The chair and I represent a number of large buildings that house condos and co-ops, and we've heard from a number of them. These buildings are old, and to comply with BEPS would be extremely expensive. And these condos and co-ops what's the word I'm looking for? they're not covered under the IRA or Empower and a number of other things. They're sort of lumped in with commercial buildings. So first and foremost, I think they need to be separated out in the regulations. And secondarily, these are seniors who are on fixed incomes. So going back to that funding question, how are we going to help them fund these improvements? And how are we going to help them with the burden of the penalties if we don't? Like I said, these are 50-plus-year-old buildings that are housing co-ops and condos of seniors on fixed incomes. And this is a great concern to them and as their representatives to us.
Yeah, this is why we really do need to continue the conversation about where are we going to get the funding to help with this transition. It's important. That's why we have the Building Energy Transition Team to think about those 10 recommendations. We talked about everything, all that you just mentioned. You've also had a lot of comments about this as well. All the stakeholder engagement and public participation, we've heard it all. And we've included all of that as part of the planning. And again, that's why it's so important that we help the buildings, all of them, everyone, to, be in a position where they can continue with this transition. So it's something we're working on. The good news is, if there's any good news to what you just said, because it doesn't sound like good news, it doesn't kick in right now. It doesn't kick in until 2031. And so we have time to work this out and keep those things at the forefront of the planning as this regulation is finalized. Would you care to add anything?
Mr. Chair, a follow-up if I may. Thank you. I appreciate that, but for these folks, they have to start planning now.
Yes.
Because that's with these old buildings, that is a lot of work and they have to start planning their funding now. Are there alternative pathways that they could use to meet these goals? I don't know if you have them or if you can think about them, but I just ask that you keep these folks on your radar screen.
We do have compliance.
Yes, so
there-
there is
yeah.
the alternative compliance fee. The fee that we were discussing earlier was established in the act. So building owners can opt to pay the fee rather than reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The regulation also has exemptions for certain cases, affordable housing, buildings with low occupancy, buildings in financial distress. And then the department has broad enforcement discretion that can include alternative compliance pathways.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
if I could, one other point, Delegate Love. In any building, an HVAC system will hit its 10, 15, 20 year and has to be replaced anyway. So in other words, this isn't necessarily in all cases an added cost. So if in the next 5 or 6 years, the hot water heaters, HVAC system, whatever, has reached its ultimate, end, the marginal cost we can discuss of replacing a gas or oil driven furnace with a heat pump. There may be some difference in marginal cost, and there are some other tax incentives and other tax breaks that go with this. So it's not a full cost. So there are a number of pieces to this, and we want to make sure we minimize the additional costs. But it's not like this is a burden on everybody all at once. I mean, they're going to have to go through this anyway.
And I'd just like to add, just to give a human touch to what you just said, it's important. And we're not going to leave, and this is what the governor says, we all believe in it, this administration, we are not going to leave them behind and leave them struggling. And just, that's not what we do. That's not who we are. So we're not pushing regulations out and said, you just have to do it, period. That's not how we operate. So that's why I said we will take all of those things into consideration and make sure we are considering all of those needs and everything, how it's impacting the folks that you just talked about. So I just wanted to give you that human piece of it, that I will be paying attention to it. We will make sure that we're able to help as much as we can.
Thank you.
Senator Washington.
Thank you, colleagues, for this. Thank you so much for this briefing and this opportunity to review the regulations. Just for context, I'm the Senate Chair for AELR. So my reference or comfortability with regulations may be different than my colleagues, and we tend to focus on law. And so there are members of the AELR committee. There are House members and there are Senate members. What's really great about that section of the law is that when we have a collaborative administration like we have now, it is in our code to be able to have a collaborative relationship around regulations. In other words, the necessity to legislate enactions of certain things are very different. So the opportunity to adopt, to allow these regulations that they promulgated to go into effect, and then for there to be an ongoing opportunity for that agency to revise those regulations is something to happen. So I just want everyone to understand that you have representatives on AELR. Also a role in this is the Senate President and the Speaker. So when it comes to COMAR and regulations, there is an opportunity for there to be a back and forth, and this is the first time that we've been able to do this, and I think we can take that opportunity. So that's just sort of the background on it. Just to Delegate Love's concern, I just want to, if you do want to look into COMAR, we are in Title 26. So it's in the environment section, and we are in Section 28. And we're looking at regulations around building energy performance standards. Okay, so in that section under performance standards, they list a number of property types. So Delegate Love, one of the property types that's in the regulation, well, there are a number of them, but there are senior living, there are residential care, there are resident hall. So I believe there could be an opportunity to, in regulation, address some specifics around there. The other, my actual question or comment or point of information is that the state of Maryland is actually currently using Medicaid dollars to provide housing, to house homeless individuals. There's something called a Medicaid waiver that we requested. The first jurisdiction to do that was Baltimore City. Again, I know this information because I chair the Joint Committee on Ending Homelessness. And so about 4 years ago, we saw that the relationship between health and housing really necessitated, and the ability for individuals who are if you are homeless or you're unhoused, your ability to follow a healthcare regime is very difficult. So it was in the interest of Medicaid to facilitate or to, in some ways, reduce costs of medical costs by allowing for housing. So it's a little more than noodling. I just want to assure the chairs that we've done this already. And so there is a mechanism for the state of Maryland to request a waiver to allow I would assume from a public health perspective, to allow for dollars. And as the secretary said, these are unused. A lot of Medicaid dollars are not used, right? So it would not take away from anyone that is currently, and I guess I should say, isn't that so? Am I correct that that is part of the consideration when you're thinking about using Medicaid dollars, or similar to what the health department is currently doing, which is allowing Medicaid dollars to be used for rent subsidies and for unaccompanied for housing?
Yeah, when we
homeless
have a conversation, and you might know more about it, and you in particular, there was conversations. Apparently someone on the task force knew that.
Yes.
Because someone brought it up. And like you said, we were all a little shocked, like,
Yeah.
what? But yeah, so that is a funding source that the task force felt
Mhm.
that we should at least look into. These are just
Mhm.
recommendations. That's all they are.
Yeah,
If they
and
don't
just-
make sense, then go ahead.
just for information, again, I know people like to know a lot of things. It is a 1115 health choice waiver. And that the program that Maryland is currently engaged in is the Assistance in Community Integration Service. So we would do a parallel thing there. So I do have a question about the covered buildings. So you said there are about 9,000 covered buildings.
Correct.
And then there are different types. There are campuses in the code, it says, and commercial buildings. Are you able to, what proportion, are covered buildings that are warehouses? What proportion are, places where people are living? I think that the committee would be sort of interested in that. And then you do exclude certain buildings, excluding schools and manufacturing and agricultural buildings. And actually it looks like a building by federal government. So I guess when we're hearing people's concerns about these
Yes.
regs, I think it's important for us to, as you have, to I don't know, reality check, but be very, be very specific about what types of housing we're talking about as a first pass.
We can provide that information, but I also think it's important to remember that my agency didn't exclude anyone. It was in the law. We just followed the law. And so
Yes,
those
so
exemptions
we
were-
excluded certain people. I'll
You
correct
did.
myself. Okay.
Yeah, if I could just add very briefly, while the BEPS and that portion of the climate solutions deals with these large buildings over 35,000 square feet, the climate plan that came out of NDE talks about electrification of beyond those buildings. So while this is the focus of today's hearing, and it was very explicit in the law, I mean, we should understand that it's not just those 9,000 buildings that are being, and I hate to say picked on, but targeted, because ultimately for us to have that 60% reduction, there's going to be a widespread electrification in buildings and homes beyond that. And the money that's going to be coming from IRA is a lot is directed towards homes, residents, whether it's having money for heat pumps or whatever. So I just want to add that context that this is a multi-headed approach that we're taking. I understood. I just didn't want that forgotten.
We'll
that's
make
all.
sure that we focus our attention on this
Agreed,
section. Thank you
agreed.
so much.
Thank you.
Let's keep it in the 43rd and go to Vice Chair Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator, my senator from 43. I do want to kind of go off of what you say, and essentially, isn't it so? First of all, I want to say the thought of using Medicaid money is pretty clever in that, in the same way we would treat a whole house, we are treating a whole person. Isn't that so? Okay, I just
Yes.
wanted to clarify that. Two, I wanted to go back to Delegate Love's questions about larger facilities and where people live. And I wanted to know whether or not the task force or the department has thought about reserve studies, Delegate Holmes' favorite topic, reserve studies as it relates to those buildings 35,000 feet or larger that would require condos, for instance, and older buildings that will require some of these conversions, how their reserve fees may then go up because of the conversion or the need to make those conversions.
Okay, you want to address that?
Sure. So one of the exemptions is for historic buildings. So if it's old enough to be an historic building, it would be exempt. And that's something we can consider farther. We did include exemptions for, cases where some buildings would be unable to implement upgrades because of their funding structure, for example, regulated affordable housing. We can look into additional cases if there's interest.
Okay, thank you. And one more question, Mr. Chair, please. So I do want to ask a question about one of Baltimore's large commercial properties that are served by district energy systems. We know they're not necessarily a regulated utility regulated by the Public Service Commission, but I want to know how the department is addressing the Climate Solutions Now Act for maximum flexibility and BEPS compliance for covered buildings. And specifically, can you discuss provisions implemented to account for the use of district energy systems? by covered buildings, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So in the proposed regulations, energy use from a district energy system does count. And the emissions associated with the creation of the heat for that district energy system. And we've had extensive conversations with the providers of district energy in Maryland about their long-term plans to decarbonize. And we're continuing those conversations to make sure that those provisions of the regulation work correctly. But generally that energy is included. So if a building is a customer of a district energy system, the emissions associated with the steam delivered, for example, to that building are included in the emissions and energy use for the building.
But I think there's a concern about providing that consistency across the energy systems, and thereby I think individual customers wouldn't necessarily be able to meet their personal goals if they can't receive the like certain amounts that they need versus spreading it across everyone for the same thing. So how are we maintaining the flexibility so those customers can meet their goals?
So it would, any individual customer, the amount that it would count would depend on how much of that energy source they're using. So it is spread out across the customers, but for every building, it is based on how much they use. We could continue
Please,
discussions.
I'd like to. I
certainly
mean,
if
if that's
I'm
Baltimore City,
misunderstanding.
greatly.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you so much.
And I would add, if I could.
Yes, sir.
Delegate, there have been conversations among suppliers who were moving in the direction of shifting to heat pumps
Sure.
and cleaner energy anyway.
Right.
I mean,
right.
whether they read the writing on the wall or they see it's a long-term savings to them. So I think whether it's district energy or some of the other people we've referred to today, it's not their first rodeo, and they're looking towards moving. They see society, and in particular Maryland, is moving towards clean energy.
Yes.
And heat pumps is a growing industry, and obviously is based on electric rather than gas-fired or oil-based. So we're also hopeful that the natural course of things is going to help us in that direction.
Well, I hope we can keep talking about it, especially because it's good old Baltimore City. Thank you so much.
Delegate Ziegler.
Mr. Chairman, I was just curious, is the fee in lieu, this is kind of back to Delegate Love's question as well, is the fee in lieu more or less than the cost of renovating a building? Do you know? Or is it designed to be more or less, I guess is a better way to ask that.
So the Climate Solutions Now Act directed us to set that at the social cost of greenhouse gases, which is an estimate of the environmental damage from emitting 1 ton of carbon dioxide produced by the federal government. And so that is where we set that alternative compliance fee. In terms of whether that cost, that's more or less than the cost of building upgrades, that could vary building by building. We estimate that 1/3 of buildings are already meeting the 2040 greenhouse gas standard, 25 years or 15 years early. A different third are already meeting the energy use intensity early. So there's a broad diversity building by building in terms of the cost they face. So some of them, the cost they face could be higher than the fee, and it would make more sense for them to simply pay the fee. And then as we work over the next 7 years to clarify where that funding would go, it could be reinvested in the covered building stock to achieve reductions. But for many buildings, it would be less expensive to make the upgrades. And again, for about 1/3 of buildings, they wouldn't have to make any changes at all to meet one standard or the other.
And I would add, in other sectors, alternative compliance payments, ACP, have been used for years, whether it's solar industry or a number of other areas. So it's not like we're breaking new ground on using ACP.
Understood. Thank you.
Vice Chair Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to follow up on the questioning of Senator Hester, District 9, and Secretary McElwain. I don't know if this is for you or Administrator Pinsky, but it's about federal funding. And I understand from friends in high places at the federal government that that over $200 billion has already gone out to other states, that other states whose climate goals are not nearly as aggressive as Maryland's have been applying and pestering and lobbying for and receiving federal funding. And the senator from District 30, Senator Elfreth, and I have been talking about some creative ideas for some that would be Mr. Pinsky, pun intended, for buildings that might be covered by BEPS or not covered by BEPS, but clearly that would advance our goals. And I'm just wondering if you could give us real specifically what we've sought as Maryland in this tough climate era, and if we haven't started yet, what are our plans? I've already reached out to our friends at Intergovernmental, but I'm worried that we're missing the opportunity and leaving money on the table that's going to other states.
Yeah, I'll just start and turn it over to you. I'll say that, and I'm not sure where you heard that from, but Maryland is definitely not leaving money behind with the federal government. We are aggressive. We have been, I know you're going to talk about some of the funding sources and revenues that we've gotten from the federal government. Even you just talked about a big grant that we got. So we are constantly every day looking at federal sources that we can tap into, to make sure that we are utilizing that funding. And I think you want to talk in particular about it.
Well, just briefly, I can't comment. I don't know what other states have received. Some of the federal grants are formula driven and some are competitive. I mean, I can tell you one of the grants, what's called the T-REC, it's training contractors. It's not even due till January 31st on the preliminary application. And on the formula, on the IRA, on the home and the HERA, we don't know when those monies are going to be released, but we're going to get them because that's formula driven. I was pleasantly surprised. Can't remember, was it in spring or winter of last year when there was a coordination effort by the key agencies that would be affected by the IRA, transportation, MD, ourselves, and others, started meeting on a regular basis to figure out who would be the lead on what and who would be secondary. So I don't think we are stuck in the starting line. I really don't, and I don't give out accolades easily. So I think we will have enough of these applied for. And again, I don't know who received it and who's speculating, or they've actually received the money.
Well, and there's a different sources of money too. I know I saw some presentations from the Department of Energy, and they were talking about all this money that's available. Oh, I can't believe Maryland hasn't taken advantage. It's sources of money that we cannot apply for. A lot of it. So the ones that we can, that are applicable for a state, then we're able to get that money. Some of it, I believe, are loans.
Right. And if
So
I
we
could,
can't,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
No, the Secretary's absolutely right. I mean, the LPO at Department of Energy, they have a lot of money.
Yes.
But initially they were saying it was in tranches of $100 million. And to shift these to low income people, it would have meant them getting loans, which we know is not going to happen. So we have been ongoing conversation with them of being creative and lowering the amount. So it just might be, and again, no investigation, no right to speak, so I can't replicate the conversations you had, but it could be a state that did in fact receive $150 million because they had ways to distribute it. We've been grappling with that. So we have not had our head in the sand on this.
Well, though your word creative is what I'm hoping for, that there's going to be creative problem solving to get some more federal funds so that we can figure out how to distribute it and cover some of these new programs. So thank you both.
I
Is there
think
more
Chris wants to
Madam
add a
Secretary?
piece to that.
Chris?
Follow up
Yeah.
with specifics.
Yeah.
We're happy to follow up with specifics, but we understand that Maryland has already received somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.9 billion in funding so far.
From the LPO or from
No,
other
no,
sources?
just I think
No.
from federal grants generally. Yep, but we can follow up with more specific
Super.
information.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, before we release you and transition to the next panel, just one quick point. I'm looking at the report and dated yesterday, the 24th of January, and it's entitled Task Force Final Report, which suggests that your task force is over. And then Delegate Holmes then invited us to participate and watch task force meetings going forward. So just to be clear, is the task force now officially complete, or is it an ongoing task force? And if it's complete, I mean, these topics are going to be ongoing. Some of your recommendations, 6 months from now are going to be moot, arguably, or at least stale. So what's the status of the task force?
Yeah.
And I'll just put that out there and leave it
Yeah,
there.
the task force have packed their bags and gone home. So it's over now. It was for this specific reason, right? But that doesn't mean we cannot continue and maybe reinvigorate that task force or maybe another one. So I agree with you. It's important that we continue to have those conversations with those stakeholders who were on that task force.
Well, thank all three of you for being here and engaging with us on this. We'll now transition to our second panel of what we're calling BEPS advocates, for lack of better terminology. So if they could come on up, and I know one is virtual. It's Aaron Sherman from RMI, Susan Stevens Miller from Earth Justice, Jose Coronado Flores from CASA, Chris Parts, and Ben Rauch. Yeah. And I know Chris is participating virtually, so just when we get to him, he'll show up on the screen, fingers crossed. But why don't you all begin when you're ready?
Screen. I would choose this one. You should be able to change the tab to yours. No. Just let me know when you need it. Chris.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Jose Coronado Flores, and I will introduce my fellow panelists soon, but we're here on behalf of Climate Partners. And we're advocating and kind of outlining how we've been engaged in the process and why these building energy performance standards are critical in a lot of different ways. So Climate Partners is a coalition of over 100 environmental, faith, consumer advocacy, and social justice organizations like mine, and we're all working to build a clean energy future in Maryland and help Maryland equitably and effectively transition and achieve its climate goals. And I'll pass it to my fellow panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Susan Miller. I'm a senior attorney with Earth Justice. Earth Justice is a nonprofit law firm that represents other nonprofits free of charge. And in my previous life, I was worked for the Maryland Public Service Commission, including approximately 8 years as general counsel to the commission.
My name is Aaron Sherman. I represent RMI, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization working to transform global energy systems. RMI provides building policy expertise and technical assistance to BEPS advocates, including Climate Partners. I'm part of the building regulations team at RMI. I provide technical assistance on building energy code and performance standard issues across the country. I'm also a resident of Odenton in District 33A.
And once again, Jose Coronado Flores. I'm CASA's climate research policy analyst, and we're Maryland's largest immigrant and working rights advocacy and services organization. Just to begin, I wanted to elaborate a little bit on the engagement we've had in the process of developing these regulations and how MDE and MEA has really brought in advocates and a lot of community-based organizations. About less than a year after Climate Solutions Now was passed, IMT and MDE came to CASA's Langley Park office and conducted a bilingual building energy performance standards presentation. And during this meeting, they heard from regular everyday tenants who live in affordable housing, and they shared a lot of the concerns that we hear in these committees about what is it going to take, how will this affect my current cost, living cost. And MDE and MEA have really been open to hearing and listening to what community members have to say. As for the Building Energy Transition Implementation Task Force, these meetings really are open. I constantly go to these meetings and I'm an active public participant. So I really want to stress the high level of engagement that these departments have had with advocates, stakeholders, and community members. So now I'll pass it to Susan.
Thank you, Jose. Before we delve into BEPS, I think it's important to bear in mind why we're doing this and what are the benefits of building electrification. The first benefit I want to discuss is improved health. Fossil fuel equipment, such as heating systems and water heaters in buildings, emit nitrogen oxides, which is a form of air pollution. This pollution is linked to respiratory, cardiovascular, cognitive, reproductive, and developmental harms, as well as cancer and premature deaths. In Maryland, fossil fuel equipment in buildings emits more than 3 times as much nitrogen oxides as all the state's power plants put together. In the Baltimore metro area, fossil fuel equipment emits more than 5 times as much nitrous oxides as the region's power plants. Lower income neighborhoods and communities of color in Maryland face disproportionately higher rates of exposure to pollution from buildings, which undermines their health and well-being. Compared to white Marylanders, African-American residents are exposed to about 70% more pollution from gas equipment, such as gas furnaces and water heaters. Get to the second slide. You can go one more. This slide demonstrates that the United States has reduced carbon emissions from electricity, but the building sector has remained flat. However, that is not even true in Maryland. In Maryland, pollution in buildings from nitrous oxide has increased 3.7% from 2017 to 2023. So Maryland is actually getting behind other states who are taking care of this problem. Millions of Maryland residents have shouldered the economic and health costs of exposure to air pollution from fossil fuel equipment. This includes the health risks I listed before, lost work days. There's an estimated 20% increase in childhood asthma associated with fossil fuel equipment. So removing nitrogen oxide from buildings is vital to the health of our citizens and will actually improve the economics for those citizens. Second thing I'd like to focus on is the lower cost for customers. Director Pinsky discussed this a little bit. Essentially, the latest high efficiency heat pumps are 3 or 4 times more efficient than fossil fuel equipment. And the cold climate heat pumps, which are now just hitting the market, are actually efficient as low as 22 degrees Fahrenheit without the need for backup heating. In Maryland, 98% of households would have lower operational costs with an air source heat pump compared to a high efficiency gas furnace. And for median low income households in Maryland would see an estimated over $370 in savings per year with a heat pump as compared to a gas furnace. A MD study estimated annualized life cycle consumer costs, including costs for equipment, operations and maintenance, and utility bills for several types of buildings, and found that most or all electric buildings will have lower life cycle costs than mixed fuel alternatives. And finally, I want to address what the gas companies have been doing while Maryland is working on its BEPS program. Maryland's 3 largest gas companies are currently undertaking massive capital investment programs through STRIDE. I know all of you have heard a lot about STRIDE. It's important, I think, to bear in mind because this sometimes gets lost. STRIDE is not a program to fix leaking pipes. Essentially, the utilities are replacing all their pipes. BGE's total spend for STRIDE for its first STRIDE phase, which went from 2014 to 2018, was $522 million, which ratepayers have to pay back. And this figure does not include the return or the profit that BGE is to earn on this program. In 2023 alone, BGE spent $160 million on its STRIDE plan. And OPC estimates that it's given its return on this investment, that's $160 million will cost customers about $576 million. BGE has stated that it plans to continue this work, which is essentially replacing every piece of pipe it owns, until its target completion date of 2043. And that at this target time, BGE will have cost customers more than $15 billion in replacing gas pipes. In its most recent rate case, which was just issued in December, BGE received approval to spend almost $400 million for 2024 to 2026 on its STRIDE program. And once again, this does not include the profit that the utility is entitled to make on capital investments. Similarly, WGL recently received approval to spend over $300 million in the next 5 years on its STRIDE pipe replacement program. It's important to note that BGE in its rate case conceded that it does not prioritize leaking pipes in its STRIDE plans. BG doesn't even have any written documentation regarding how specific projects are selected. So there's no way to judge how they're selecting or whether they're doing a good job. Gas replacement programs are expensive, install long-lived assets, and are built on the assumption that gas systems' future needs will be the same or similar to the system's present needs, which we all know is not correct. Neither BG nor WGL examine alternatives to replacing these pipes. They simply replace the pipes because replacing the pipes is what gives them a return on the investment. The disincentive to just fix the pipes is fixing the pipes. You receive your cost or expense for fixing, but you don't receive a return on investment. You don't make a profit on that money you spent. These expenditures are already unnecessary, and electrification will avoid saddling ratepayers with costly investment that they will be paying for over decades. So one of the benefits of building electrification will ultimately be avoiding saddling ratepayers with billions of dollars of pipe replacement costs that are unnecessary. And now I'd like to turn it over to Erin.
Thank you, Susan. I'll speak a little bit more to the proposed BEPS rules in particular. I'll start by just summarizing some of the things that they do concretely. What is in those rules? What do they do? So first of all, as discussed previously by the last panel, MDE is statutorily obligated to promulgate these BEPS rules. And in particular, they're obligated by statute to reach this zero direct emissions by 2040 goal. That is aligned with Maryland's broader decarbonization goal across the economy of net zero by 2045. There really is no way to reach that goal without going through these large buildings. So it's critical that they're aligned as soon as possible. On that kind of note, I want to emphasize that BEPS, these rules today in 2024, prior to the beginning of benchmarking, provide signals to building owners about what will be expected of them in the future. They allow better forward planning. The period of time between now and 2040 is in many cases about the lifetime of a piece of equipment in a large building. So during that cycle, replacements will happen, repairs will happen, recapitalization will happen. So we're considering the incremental costs of compliance with BEPS over that cycle compared to the cost that would have been occurred without BEPS. And this signal now of these targets, both for direct emissions and for site energy use intensity or EUI, they can help building owners prepare sooner now and make those plans. At the same time, as data comes in, as benchmarking occurs, there are opportunities to edit the targets to reflect what is learned through that benchmarking, to reflect the most recent information, and to make sure that those targets are fair and reasonable as well as aligned with statute. It's really important that we keep in mind we have this 2040 or 2045 goal, and we're probably not going to succeed best by setting a plan that is perfect and immutable now. We'll succeed better by learning as we go and adjusting, but keeping our eye on that goal. These rules follow best practices. As mentioned by the prior panel, Maryland is far from the only jurisdiction that has either passed a law or adopted rules for a building energy performance standard, in addition to the pure jurisdictions such as Colorado and Washington, Washington State, large cities such as New York City, Denver, Seattle, that have considered or are already promulgating these regulations. There are many more cities across the country, as well as states, that are a member of the National Building Performance Standards Coalition that are looking at this type of policy and planning to adopt it as part of their climate action plans in coming years. The specifics of these rules, I'm happy to do a little bit of compare and contrast between Maryland's and other jurisdictions if that's of interest to the committee. Overall, Maryland's rules are sound and strong compared to their peer jurisdictions. Happy to talk more about that if of interest. Finally, we've heard about multifamily housing and some concerns here earlier in the hearing. There is a specific exemption within the rules for affordable housing. I think it's important to note the definition of affordable housing does not depend on the housing being subject to kind of formal recognition or like having been built or funded by HUD, for example. It is inclusive of naturally occurring affordable housing. So in some buildings, for example, that do have a large proportion of fixed income folks living in them, it's really critical that they take a look at this exemption and whether they would qualify, because it would allow every year for such a building to look at what it's able to do, given its resources and given the incentives that they're eligible for, and to potentially apply for an exemption that would reduce their alternative compliance fee for that year, as long as they are demonstrating that they're working toward a decarbonization plan. Next slide, please. Thanks. Beyond what the rules do in the kind of direct sense, what will the outcomes be? And again, the prior panel spoke to this a fair bit, so I'm just going to speak relatively quickly about this. These will save energy. They'll save over $200 billion on energy bills. They will also ease pressure on the grid as written. This is really important to note that the site energy use intensity targets achieve this goal, as mentioned on the prior panel. We've also been talking about federal funding. I think one source of federal funding that is very specific to rules of this nature and wouldn't incur trade-offs in Maryland against other climate priorities is the technical assistance for advanced building energy codes. Up to 20 million for standards such as BEPS could be won through a competitive grant for Maryland here. And finally, just repeating, as Susan said, this will protect Marylanders' health. Pass to Jose.
Thank you. And I would like to talk a little bit about the environmental and climate justice perspective of BEPS. So first of all, any and all emissions reduction efforts are a form of climate and environmental justice for the reasons that it's reducing local pollution in communities, but we're also contributing to reducing emissions and slowing down and attempting to mitigate the quickly accelerating effects of global warming. On this facet, there's also the point that not all countries can deal with global warming the same. Not even in the state do all areas deal with global warming the same. So the efforts we put here are as part of a larger picture of reducing the effects of global warming and trying to make the earth livable in the next 100 years. But more tangibly, BEPS is one of the ways that we can address major housing issues, as well as addressing energy injustice. BEPS would require apartment complexes that have been left to rot or haven't been really kept up to finally make these much needed renovations to make safe living conditions for the tenants. And in my next slide, I'll share how this could affect 2 apartment communities in Maryland in a very positive way. And as I mentioned first, the fact is that a lot of these large multifamily residential communities are in communities that are already overburdened by different forms of pollution, whether it's major roadways or industrial parks nearby. BEPS is one way to reduce pollution in these communities and chip away at the issue of emissions and the way they impact people's health and how they impact the environment as a whole. And finally, the Building Energy Transition Task Force has produced some recommendations, and these recommendations do involve tenant empowerment. For example, one of the things that are recommended is in order for some of the communities that are really desperate to improve their housing conditions, they recommend a petition. And this petition is one that you can print off, for example, the page, a web page on DHCD's website, and tenants download it, print it out, and collect signatures from their neighbors, and they could send it back to a state agency, and the state agency would then connect with the property owner to outline the different incentives that are possible and help them transition. And to end our presentation, I want to just share with you two apartment communities that would benefit from these BEPS standards. One is Bedford Victoria Station Apartments in Langley Park, which is District 47B, and Oak Ridge Apartments in East Riverdale, District 22. So Bedford Victoria is 587 units that would be covered under BEPS. And this would mean that the individuals living in this community would have access to improved energy efficient appliances and weatherized homes, which would tackle a significant portion of the housing concerns that some of the apartment communities around the state that have been left unattended and with very little maintenance. It would address this. And specifically for the Oak Ridge Apartments, I want to highlight the fact that East Riverdale is a community, a census tract that has an environmental justice score of 87, making it one of the highest in the state, which translates to the fact that there are a lot of people of color. It's an immigrant and African-American community. A lot of low-income individuals live there as well. And in combination to this, it's close to a lot of pollution, major roadways, and an industrial park nearby. BEPS is part of the equation that helps reduce pollution as a total in communities like these two. And with that, I thank chairs, vice chairs, and committee members for taking the time to listen to us.
Chris Parts is going next. We have swapped order on the schedule.
Yep, there he is.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chair Corman, Chair Feldman, committee members, and my Senator Washington. My name is Chris Parts. I'm an architect with AI Maryland, representing nearly 2,000 architects across the state of Maryland. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in this briefing today, and I particularly appreciate the opportunity to join remotely as I'm on crutches and housebound, recovering from surgery for a couple more weeks. I work in a design firm that has several specialty sectors that focus on a variety of design needs, pre-K through 12 education, higher ed, affordable housing, market rate, and senior housing, as well as healthcare design. I tend to work on existing and renovation projects rather than just working within one specialty area. I've straddled across all areas in the realm of retrofit and renovation. I'd like to speak today briefly from a very broad perspective and then focus a little bit more specifically to Maryland. Since 2010, the American Institute of Architects has had what's called a 2030 program, measuring annual performance of the architecture and design community toward a goal of carbon neutral buildings by 2030. When this started in 2010, we had 56 firms participating in annual reporting, and we're now up to 428 firms. When this started, we were tracking just operating carbon, and as it's evolved, we've shifted to add information being tracked to include energy by fuel source, renewable energy, and encouraging all members to really start modeling embodied carbon on projects as well. The data is collected from participating firms each year, and today I'm sharing a few statistics from projects that were with data collected from the year of 2022. So from 2010 to 2022, commercial buildings energy use intensity has reduced 43%, 39.8% for residential buildings. But our target for AIA is an 80% reduction in order to try to meet our 2030 goal. Building energy consumer savings in these buildings that have been measured and collected amounts to $530 billion based on energy costs forecast in 2010. So that's less money spent on energy and a reduced load on the grid. The 2022 data collected had 346 buildings that are predicted to be a zero net energy building, and nearly 1,000 projects that actually met that 80% predicted energy use intensity target. But that's only 4% of the 23,276 projects that were reported. So the data tells me that we know how to achieve these targets across all market sectors. We have some clients who have made this a priority. We have solutions to drive the numbers higher, but without higher expectations, the choice to achieve more is not necessarily being made. The data also shows a plateau of the energy use intensity reduction since 2018. We've successfully cut the energy use intensity considerably over the past 12 years, but without additional encouragement, that needle simply has not measurably moved in the last few years. The data also shows that of the buildings reported, half of the buildings now reported are all electric. Another 21% or 75% or more electric, and the remaining 29% still use fossil fuels. So looking more specifically at Maryland, AIA 2030 data shows that Maryland has a 47% average predicted energy use intensity reduction, which is on par with the national average of 48%. On Tuesday in my office, I reached out across our market sectors to see where our Maryland projects are relative to decisions on energy source for new construction. Virtually all systems in the work that we have being planned and being built today is all electric, chosen as the safest and most efficient systems to work with in virtually eliminating site-based carbon. We have one school project that was just completed that is net zero ready with the addition of planned solar panels. And we have one dormitory project in design that's being planned to be a net zero project. Without the BEPS standards, most owners of new projects are choosing not to use fossil fuels. We have projects that are more efficient than those designed, say, 5 years ago, but without requirements driving them further. Most projects being designed and systems being selected will not drive us to the carbon zero goals on their own. Without the BEPS standards, equipment selection for many projects may even continue to opt to go with fossil fuels, kicking the can of zero carbon further down the road. When I look now at where we are now in Maryland, I look back at my middle school self in the early 1970s to learn the metric system, our soon to be adopted system of measure. Fear and reluctance to change thwarted that initiative, and here we remain with a system different from all others, and we continue to struggle holding on to old systems while others operate with a much more sensible measure. We clearly need vision and measurable goals to move ahead, and I believe the BEPS outlines a sensible process of achievement. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. Had to cross out morning in my talk. I'm Ben Rausch. I'm a mechanical engineer and a fire protection engineer with FSI Engineers. Here to speak a little bit about the technical aspect and to address some things I heard in the original Climate Solutions Now testimony, and I expect to hear in the room again today, or that you're hearing from your constituents that deserve to be addressed. So making a short list I'll say misleading facts. They need more context to be fully understood. It's an unbearable cost for building owners. Buildings need gas. There aren't electric options. You're going to take my gas stove away. Heat pumps don't work. The electric grid can't handle the building electrification. Maryland is only 0.1% of world energy emissions, so we shouldn't do anything. And energy use intensity shouldn't be required. Going to address those one at a time. An unbearable cost for building owner, as Mr. Pinsky, and we're all probably still getting used to saying that, as Mr. Pinsky said, all mechanical systems need to be replaced every 15 to 20 years. You're going to spend that money as a building owner. The marginal cost, and we've done several energy audits looking at this with BEPS in mind since the original Climate Solutions Now, the marginal cost is between nothing, sometimes it can actually cost slightly less, up to 30%. The most we've seen so far is just over 30% over just replacing the system in kind that was already there with gas. So there is a cost. It is a marginal cost, and perhaps we do want to address that. I know there's a bill out right now for Empower funds for allowing that to also go for electrification, not just energy reduction. There are ways to address that, and yes, building owners should have that. But when you hear numbers like I heard in Climate Solutions Now of $40,000 something cost per apartment, that's the total cost of equipment. That's not the marginal cost. So you should be asking more about that. Building needs gas. There aren't electric options. I want to be clear. The heat pump market has made remarkable strides in the last few years, even since Climate Solutions Now passed. And there aren't many things, with the exceptions of steam boilers at the building scale. Steam boilers at a grid scale, at a district energy scale, they can do heat pumps. But at a building scale, that is our one hurdle left to surmount with heat pumps. Everything else can be made a heat pump. Everything else. There might be an electric service upgrade that building has to undertake. What we've seen in our projects, and we have been going through this in Seattle for the last code cycle. Part of my firm sits over on the West Coast. It's a 5% at most upgrade to do that electrical service relative to the overall mechanical upgrade. You're going to take my gas stove away. Climate Solutions now specifically exempted gas stove. You can keep your gas stove in an otherwise electrically heated and electrically domestic water heated building. Go ahead. There's all sorts of gas appliances you can keep. You can keep your generator. There you go. Heat pumps don't work in our climate. So I know where this comes from. I grew up slightly younger than Chris in the early 80s with heat pumps that you had to turn over to emergency heat, and they blew cold air all winter. And that's not our reality of heat pumps anymore. We have heat pumps that'll run down into the negative degrees. We have heat pumps that'll run down to full capacity for anything we're going to see in Maryland, that 5-degree range for design temperature, and they blow hot air just like a furnace. So comfort issues, compatibility issues, they exist now. So they work fine in our climate. The electric grid can't handle building electrification. We conveniently have a report from the Public Service Commission showing we need a 2.1% growth per year for the next decade to handle all buildings and all transportation in the state. 2.1%. For reference, the state has grown at double that rate at some points in our past, in the 80s and early 90s. Maryland is only 0.1% of the world energy emissions. I heard this in Climate Solutions Now and said, that can't be right. That's a giant number. It didn't have the impact I think that the person was trying to have when they said that. It is a giant number. It's approximately 37 million metric tons of CO2 per year at 0.1%. That is a giant number to take down to net zero. So yes, we are 0.1% of the world's energy use. We're 6.1 million people. Do the math and it doesn't look great. And then EUI shouldn't be required for buildings. Let's be clear that the most recent BEPS regulations, the ones that were released in draft form that we've been doing public commentary on, that you've been hearing about all day, have an EUI target that buildings must hit. It is important to the grid, and this is a tragedy of the commons type situation. Do building owners pay to upgrade their systems to actually hit EUI targets, or does all of society pay to have a bigger electric grid? So it is a question, and I'm not the one who's going to answer that. I'm an engineer working on individual buildings. BEPS is an important part of achieving carbon reductions along with vehicle electrification, and you're going to see a bill about an all-electric building code, so we stop building existing new stock gas buildings. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you all very much. First question is Delegate Stein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to everyone for your presentation, and apologies for being late to the briefing. This question is for Ben and Chris. Could you elaborate a little bit more about the sort of variety of projects, renovation projects for buildings that you've worked on where it's been electrification for the renovation?
I'll start a list, and then Chris, his firm works on a wider range than we work on. So we have done many multifamily, senior living. We've done a few institutional style projects, large scale congregate living, things like that. We have done several warehouses. Those are actually quite an easy lift, to your point from before, to electrify. And we've done a couple industrial. We on the West Coast side, because there is an all electric energy code pushing it, we are required to. So even for large scale manufacturing clients, it is now a possibility. And then Chris, you've got others, I know.
Sure, and I'll add that we have done public and private pre-K through 12 education. Most private pre-K through 12 is focused on all electric. Public, I think, tends to still look at gas and commercial kitchens, but virtually everything else is still all electric. A lot of higher education projects and healthcare design as well. And Ben has commissioned many of our housing projects. Again, the range from 18-story high-rise projects down to 2-story walk-ups.
Yeah, specific to residential, we've commissioned probably 50 in the last decade in Maryland, and I can think of 2 of them that had natural gas heating. that weren't primarily heat pump based systems. And I can think of maybe 5 that had central plant style domestic water heating that was gas. Most of them have distributed water heaters. It's actually really rare to build a primarily gas building in that segment anymore.
Mr. Chair, if I could just follow up with a quick question. And these renovation projects, which have been electrification of, say, the HVAC systems, they've been, in your experience, cost effective, factoring in both the upfront costs and the operating costs.
Yeah. So again, if you look at it at a marginal cost basis, and we go after utility funding for regular efficiency targets, we don't have them for electrification. I would love to have that. But if you go after all the utility incentives, we get down to below a 5 to 7 year payback, which is usually acceptable for our developer crowd. And if we look at future life cycle costing, total cost of ownership, including utilities, it is a stark contrast because of what gas prices are supposed to do in the next 2 decades. So if you look over a 15 or 20 year system life, the cost of ownership of an electric system is just drastically smaller. It's not a little bit, it's no comparison smaller.
And I might add, I'm currently working on one co-op housing project now that has just shy of 100 units. The one thing that they're not doing electric on that right now is a hot water heating system that's 5 years old. So we've made them aware that they will need to be converting that to all electric, and they're aware, but they're working, expecting another 10 years of life out of that system. They will probably be facing higher gas costs as they're retaining that equipment, but basically they're able to plan ahead for replacing that system with an all electric system.
Thank you.
Great. Just a reminder, my colleagues and the panelists, we do have another whole panel after this, so keep that in mind as you're asking your questions. Delegate Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be quick. Ben, the list that you gave of the facts was very helpful. I don't see any meeting materials from you, and I was trying to take notes, but I couldn't get it down quickly. Can you send us that information?
I can. I will need to know where to send it, but yes, I can share my notes that is mostly matching. I paraphrase some of that because other people have covered it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yep.
And I was also instructed to remind you all that the Senate has bill hearings this afternoon also. Delegate Healy.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman. I have just a question about heat pumps and retrofitting older buildings where you have heat systems that are very old, that are radiators. They don't have forced air. They can't use a heat pump unless you replace remove all the radiators and put in a whole new system with ducts and everything else. And people who have been living, senior citizens, people who've been living in these buildings for a long time, they're not historic buildings, they're just old.
Yep.
Is there a program to deal with the marginal, you're talking about marginal cost, but if you have a system that you could just easily swap one thing out for another, but this is like major renovations. Have you dealt with any of that? Is there a plan to help that cadre of buildings?
Yeah, so we're doing 3 audits on DC buildings for their BEP system right now that fit exactly what you're talking about. Very old, pre-war, not historic registry. There's no benefit to that, or historic skin only. We don't actually get to count the mechanical systems. And you have pinpointed the biggest challenge. So there are heat pumps that we can put in that will replicate a boiler-like system, but those systems are so old that the rest of the system is often falling apart as well. It's not worth saving. So they're looking at an immense cost to replace that system, no matter what they replaced it with, even if they replace it in kind. So most of those buildings are now going to a heat pump based technology that moves refrigerant through the building. It gets technical in a quick hurry, and I'm happy to go have lunch and have a half-an-hour discussion on it. But the most cost effective system for those buildings is a heat pump replacement. It is not a boiler in kind replacement, replacing all that pipe and equipment when they need to entirely replace systems. And in those buildings that you're talking about, they're limping those systems along. In some cases, they replace the boilers, but none of the terminal equipment, none of the radiators, none of the piping. That piping has a 50-year life if it's treated well. They aren't always treated well in an apartment building.
Right.
So it's...
I live in an old community in an old neighborhood, and the houses are old, and so are the apartment building. So
Yep.
I just was curious as to and I would like to, I'll take you up on that. We'll talk later.
Yeah.
Thank you. Offline.
Vice Chair Boyce.
Very quickly, thank you so much for this. I do want to ask about cost as it relates to whole building, whole house costs. So there's a replacement of the equipment, but then how does that work within the energy efficiency of a whole building itself when you have to take that in consideration? So you got a new system, but you know, the windows are bad or the insulation is bad or so on and so forth. So I wanted to know about that aspect of cost.
It's an interesting one. So at the home scale, doing a whole home audit and doing upgrades where they make sense, replacing a window, fixing the door ceiling, great. At a commercial scale, at a large scale building, that adds up to a real cost in a quick hurry. So when we do, as a firm, when we do building audits, even if it's like, I want to look at HVAC systems, we're going to tell you about your windows. It is often a major gap. It is air leakage. And when you get the replacement cost and you look at the payback on actual energy savings for some of those, they do not make a lot of sense. So they're going to ride out those windows until they're truly failing. So there is always a life cycle. What is this going to cost me, the building owner? There is often also, particularly in residential, an office, a mismatch between who pays for the retrofit upgrade and who's paying the utility bills. If your tenant's paying your utility bills, why do you care to save a lot of energy unless you have to? It is a mismatch in incentive structure.
Great. Well, thank you to this panel. We'll now transition to our third and final panel of industry representatives. Tom Ballantyne, Vice President for Policy for NAIOP Maryland, Brian Anlou, Vice President of Government Affairs, AOBA, Rick Riemann, Task Force member and MWH board member, and Stuart Kaplow, another one of the task force members.
Give me a moment, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to remember my tech orientation.
Your tech support is walking up right behind you.
Go to. I'm sorry.
Do you want a bigger screen?
There we go, just like at home. Well, thank you, Chair Corman, Chair Feldman, Vice Chairs Boyce and Kagan, committee members. My name's Tom Ballantyne. I'm here representing NAIOP Maryland. We're a commercial real estate trade association, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak on these important topics today. If there is one message that you take away from my part of the presentation is on behalf of our members to urge your continued engagement to ensure that the decarbonization pathway provides technically feasible, cost-effective opportunities for building owners and for occupants. First, I'll just reset on the greenhouse gas context. This slide, I'm on automatic, looks like. So in 2022, the direct emissions from the building sector accounted for 13% of the statewide emissions, about 10.9 million metric tons, almost evenly split between residential and commercial. And the Pathways report sets a 2031 target of about half that for the building sector. So how are we proposed to get there? The House Committee had a briefing on the PSC Brattle report. The internals of that, the inputs to the modeling, really give us a good kind of clear view into what it will take to achieve those emissions reductions within the building sector. Convert heating equipment serving 400 million square feet of commercial space to cold climate and ground source heat pumps. Convert water heating equipment serving about 460 million square feet. Convert about 2 million pieces of heating, air conditioning, and water heating equipment in multifamily, single family residential to heat pump equipment. And adopt energy efficiency programs that are consistent with the maximum achievable scenarios that were filed by the utilities in the Empower proceedings. And those make assumptions about including measures that are unconstrained by spending limits or cost effectiveness tests. The other thing that's in that set of assumptions is that they will achieve a 15 to 30% participation in demand management and other kinds of programs that will help to manage peak load, thermostat adjustments, interruptible tariffs, utility access to charge or discharge behind the meter battery banks. This slide gives a little bit of a look at the change in the share of commercial space served by electric and fossil fueled space heating, water heating equipment in 2022 and 2030. The electric equipment's in blue, fossil in gray. You see there's a fairly high percentage of conversion from one category to another, but I also like you to take a look at the dark blue bars in the electric equipment sections, because they're converting what is today resistance electric equipment that is less efficient into very high efficient heat pump products, and in very high amounts. This is the demand management slide here. The Brattle Group found existing demand management programs to be fairly low in subscription, but that they needed to ramp up very quickly in order to hit the 2031 targets. So the purpose of the study was not to assess BEPS, but it does give us a pretty clear look at what needs to happen within the building industry. It was also very clearly stated in the report that it doesn't address the cost effectiveness of building electrification, doesn't address the technical feasibility of or the availability of some electrification technologies, distribution system upgrades, decommissioning parts of the gas system, environmental justice issues. Our question there is really, how reasonable is it to expect that we can hit those targets with the tools that we have available to us today? This slide begins to look at the kind of the conceptual, the trajectory model. This is the compliance pathway for buildings under BEPS. The 2025 time period is measuring and reporting baseline energy use. By 26 or 27, buildings will have a baseline from which to measure their compliance requirements. And this is on autopilot here. The first deadline is 2030, where direct. Thank you. And I'll use the arrow. Yeah, thanks. I was on the last one. I was on this one. 2030 is the first deadline. Direct greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced 20% below the average for the category of building. And they also have to hit a 33% progress towards reaching their terminal energy use target. There's another checkpoint in 2035. The Climate Solutions Now Act had checkpoints in 2030 and 2040. But because the trajectory model was adopted as part of the regulation, there's now an interim step where buildings have to hit 60% below their emissions in the category and 67% of the progress towards the final energy use target cap. And then in 2040, these buildings need to be 100% greenhouse gas net zero and have to hit the final energy use target. Couple things that concern us about this is that it assumes that emissions and energy use reductions will happen on a set schedule in even amounts, when in reality the way that buildings undergo major renovations is when equipment reaches the end of its useful life, at sale, at refinance, and it will happen in bunches, not in set even and a straight trajectory. There aren't any provisions in the regulation at this point to address those kinds of situations and allow alternative schedule and alternative compliance approaches. This slide starts to look at the gap between the average emissions for certain building types and the 2030 and 2035 targets. We have data in Montgomery County for many building types. And in this case, we selected multifamily office and warehouse. The 4 buildings that reported some emissions, the gap to the 2030 targets is extremely wide. Office buildings that reported emissions would need to reduce by 84% in order to hit the state's greenhouse gas limit for 2030. Multifamily buildings, the gap was 41. And for warehouse emissions, it was over 90% reduction in order to hit the performance target that's in the regulation. It points to one of the concerns that we have is that the targets have been selected and published before the energy benchmarking has been completed. The technical report shows that the vast majority of emission reductions occur at the utility power generating facilities off-site. The purple line in this graph is the reduction in utility scale emissions. And the 2 lines at the bottom are the building industry or building sector energy and emissions reductions. That displaces that responsibility. The BEPS originally was conceived as an emission standard for buildings, and that the utility scale emissions and the way that the division of responsibility has been handled in the past, those emissions are either a partnership between building owners and utilities, or they're the direct emissions of utility generating facilities are dealt with by the utilities at the utility scale using other means such as Empower.
So I don't want to rush you past important information, but I just want to remind you, these senators have bill hearings to get to, and they probably want to eat before then. So just if you could try to keep all of your testimony tight so we can get to any questions.
Okay.
Appreciate you being here.
I'll just finish with this. We see the current proposal as relying too heavily on penalties, doesn't provide mechanisms to develop alternative compliance pathways and alternative schedules that recognize unique building characteristics. And with that, I'll stand for questions later. Want to switch?
All right. I know we're holding you from lunch, so I will be very quick. I have a much longer presentation that gets a little more deeper into the costs that I'm about to share with you all. Happy to also arrange meetings with my members and their building engineers, as well as our consultants, to talk more about the cost.
Brian, can you also just identify yourself for the audience?
Yeah, Brian Anlou with the Apartment and Office Building Association of Metropolitan Washington, representing apartment and office buildings in Montgomery and Prince George's County. So I'm gonna talk a little bit more about costs, as I said. Let me just go into full screen mode here. So I want to start off by saying that my members want to do their part to fight climate change, but their part needs to make financial sense, both for the owners of the apartment and office buildings, but also for their tenants. So with that, it's not just condos that are going to have a hard time meeting these standards, is also multifamily building owners. There's this perception that multifamily building owners are making money hand over fist off the back of tenants. I'm here to tell you that's not the case. On average, they're only making about a 5% return. That's less than half the average return of the stock market based on corporate mortgage-backed security data. And a lot of those margins are used to fund additional housing, but they're also being squeezed by legislative mandates like BEPS, like things like sprinklers, and those sorts of mandates. With that, I'm sharing Montgomery County standards here for reference. This is the Stephen Winters Associates technical report that was done for the county. The county considered 3 different target approaches to setting their site EUI standard. What I want to convey here is that if you see what's in the red box, each of the approaches has a different cost associated with it. The county went with the highest cost option, which is the zero net carbon approach, and that sets a site EUI target of 37 for multifamily buildings. That approach is roughly 33% higher than the next approach, which is the EEZNC midpoint. But that only gets you about a 5 percentage point reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So again, 5 percentage points only gets you, costs you 33% more. And we can talk again, if you want to meet individually, more on how we got those numbers. But again, that's from the county report. The county's number, by the way, is higher than what the state is proposing for multifamily. This county standard is 37 multifamily site EUI. The state is proposing a 29 site EUI. So a lower standard, much more harder to achieve and much more unattainable. With that, we also hired Stephen Winters, again, the same consulting and engineering firm that the county hired to do a BEPS analysis for us as well. And this is what they came back with for the cost of state BEPS compliance. It's $60 per square foot. Translating that to individual units, that's roughly $42,000 to $60,000 per unit, or it would require a $400 to $600 a month increase in rent to be able to fund those improvements. I know you heard earlier from one of the speakers on the pro side that you need to look at the marginal costs. And while it's true that some of these improvements do need to happen anyway, they're not on the same schedule as what the state is imposing, and the energy efficiency measures may not always be the same. And so that's where you're going to see that gap in terms of costs and the different challenges with that. I also want to highlight the simple payback years that you see and the lifespan of the improvements very quickly, because one of the things that the secretary pointed out is that there's going to be an energy payback that's going to help offset some of these costs. I'm here to tell you that the Berkeley model had an energy payback period of 16 years. That exceeds the useful life of domestic hot water upgrades, HVAC upgrades, which have 15-year useful lifespans respectively. The only improvements that doesn't exceed the useful life of is things like doors and windows, air barrier continuity, and cooking fuel conversion. So yes, there will be some energy savings, but it may not always offset the useful life of the equipment, and you'll have to make those improvements again down the road. Implementation order matters. So how these energy efficiency measures are done matters in terms of the total number of measures that need to be done, and corresponding with that, the cost of the measures. The best implementation order is the load reduction, electrification, the load reduction, envelope improvements, and then electrifications. But as you can see, that changes the costs in that bottom chart there. And the point of showing you that is that the state's trajectory model, which is a straight line, it's not going to work that way because the highest site EUI savings improvements are backloaded in that scenario, in that implementation order. And so it's more of a ladder. You have the improvement, it steps down the site EUI a little bit. You do some more improvements, it steps down the site EUIs even more. So it's more of a ladder rather than a straight trajectory model. So that's why there's some flaws in those assumptions. Just very quickly, a case study that one of our members did for a property in Montgomery County that they looked at what it would cost. The number you see here on the chart in the left, the $21,000 per unit, that does not include the things in the red box. It does not include the Pepco heavy up costs. It does not include triggered code upgrades. It does not include financing, and it doesn't include having to move tenants out and potentially losing income from moving those tenants out. So just the $21,000 gets you a 14% rent increase or an additional $218 per month. If you include the things in the red box, you're getting closer to $45,000 a unit. And that's going to be an even higher increase. In lots of parts of our state and county, those increases aren't going to be, the market can't bear those level of increases. So they're effectively unrecoverable. Not to mention that Montgomery County now has rent control that limits how much you can increase rents anyway. So with that, I know some of the other members of our panel will, and Mr. Ballantyne have touched on some of the recommendations. I'll defer to them to touch on the rest. But again, as I said, if you all are interested more in the case studies and costs that AYOBA has done through our consultants and our members, I'd love to meet with you all and have a much more in-depth presentation on that. Thanks again.
Just because I can hear the senator's sighs, I'm just going to remind you all again that they have hearings that they need to get to. So-
Absolutely. Brian covered a lot of my things too, so I will go quickly. So my name is Rick Bremen. I'm the Vice President of Atlantic Realty Group, a local family-owned multifamily-based company in Hunt Valley. We service about 2,000 apartments, over 14 apartment communities, primarily in Baltimore City. I also represent the Maryland Multifamily Housing Association as a board member. MMHA members operate 210,000 apartments over 958 apartment communities, serving approximately 538,000 residents. So I'm here today to talk about the challenges that owners will face when it comes to multifamily housing that relates to BEPS. One of the big challenges is that greenhouse gas emissions have to be reduced, but also the regulations add in this EUI component that's been talked about today. And that is a big lift for multifamily owners. The thing I want to point out first before we get into that is the timelines. So we heard earlier, June 1st is the benchmark date of when all the data is due into the Energy Star portfolio. The challenge that concerns us is that this data is not readily available in a format that owners can access. The regs rely on the local utility providers to provide this information. And they're going to be required to provide that starting January 1st, 2025. Building owners at that point will need to enter all that data into Energy Star and will be going after the utility companies with 9,000 requests. As we heard earlier, there's approximately 9,000 buildings that need to provide this data. So there's going to be this mad rush at the beginning of the year to compile all this data that building owners, especially in the multifamily industry, have not seen that data yet. Multifamily owners do not pay the utility bills for the residents. Those residents have separate accounts, separate meters, all with the utility companies. In the event that that system fails, it could potentially be a big lift for the multifamily owners to try and capture all that data from all the units that they operate. They'll be asking their residents for 12 months of BGE bills. This is a huge undertaking and one that should not be taken lightly. Speaking from experience, our company, we did a MIHA project, which is the Multifamily Energy Efficiency and Housing Affordability Program back in 2018. At the time, we were required to get all the bills from the residents. It took us 10 months just to do that. And this was a smaller property of about 93 units. And that was just constant tracking down of the residents and trying to get this information so that we could provide that to the MIHA program so we could get funding for the program that they were proposing. So I encourage us to look at the dates, and it might be a good idea to push out the dates a bit so that we allow the data to mature. If you want to set realistic goals, you need to see where the building stock is in June of 2025. Today, we don't know that number. All we have is analysis. We have different studies that have been done, but we don't know the real data yet. So it'd be very important to look at that. And I would recommend that perhaps, we study that for a few years and come up with additional goals. Moving on to slide 2 here. This is where we start to talk about EUI. One of the components of the regs is that EUI for apartments especially forces the building owners to not only do the greenhouse gas emission reductions, but also immediately electrify their buildings. Whereas the Climate Solutions Now Act, they had 15 years to do that. You had until 2040. With the EUI component of 29, which has been mentioned as an unrealistic number to hit. As of today, the EPA sets it at 59. So there's a full reduction there of 30 points in EUI that needs to be achieved. And in order for multifamily building owners to meet that, they would need to electrify their buildings in 4.5 years, considering that we have the data in June of 2025. Brian talked about cost. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on cost because we've already covered that, but it is quite expensive to do this undertaking. I mentioned here a property that our organization owns and operates. The average rents there are about $1,700 a month. If we were to do an electrification at that property, it would be over $28 million to do that project. So that's $65,000 a door, very, very expensive to do. And there's no return for the owner because the utilities are paid by the resident. And what happens to the resident in those situations? So the renter will get hit with an increase in rent to pay for these upgrades. They might save about $400 a year annually on their utilities. It's also very disruptive. We heard about the incremental cost of just replacing out existing equipment, but what is not factored in is that you have to replace out gas dryers. Well, a gas dryer requires that you run a 240 volt electric line to where that dryer is placed. If you have to replace the stove, you're doing the same thing. You're replacing the panel, electrical panel. The other thing that we're finding on our internal analysis is that we may have to take out the kitchen cabinets, the countertops, the backsplashes in order to access piping that's in these apartments. A resident cannot live in an apartment during this time. That's going to cause vacancy loss. More importantly, that resident's going to be displaced for a period of time. They might not want to move. Why should they have to move to another apartment in order to save $400 a month? It's just not fair to them in order to meet that EUI standard. A year, I'm sorry, 400 a year. Yes, thank you for correcting that.
Okay, guys, let's let him do his presentation.
Yeah. So the other side is on the ownership side. Owners will have to get loans. In certain situations, the owner may be over levered. In our industry, owners may buy a property and put down 20%, 30%, but then they're going to have to comply with this program. And in that situation, they may owe more money on what the property is worth at that point. It's not a good investment at that time. We'll also see if things like that start to happen, you could see value of assets decline, which will impact assessments, which will then impact real estate taxes. So thank you for your time. I appreciate the opportunity today.
You stay there. Yeah, Rick, if you'd stay there, if I could very quickly, because I realize I have the enviable position of being last. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, in particular, Delegate Holmes, who sat on the task force. My name is Stuart Kaplow. I'm an environmental attorney. I represent a lot of these folks around the country doing sustainability work and increasingly around the world. I also have the opportunity to be the acting chair of the Maryland Green Building Council. My role today is simply to speak for myself. I'll make 4 quick points and let everybody get to lunch. The first is just this week, Maryland was recognized among the top 10 states for green building in the country. If we move forward with this energy use intensity proposed regulation, we no longer will be. It's simply a policy decision about where our priorities should be. I certainly would not tell you that where the correct answer is, except to note that they're not necessarily consistent. The second point I would make, EUI, we've had a lot of discussion. Energy use intensity, I feel the need to define it for you all. It basically is energy per square foot. So sort of what it costs, the measure of how much energy a building uses per square foot. So if you're a landlord and you have to regulate energy per square foot in your commercial lease, you now need to add a new provision in your lease that says the tenant may not use more than a certain number of kilowatt hours per square foot. That's what we're all talking about. But importantly, when this General Assembly passed this law, it did not mandate EUI be regulated. That is a function of the Maryland Department of Environment. The language on the screen points out that the statute that you all passed described EUI as a target for setting the greenhouse gas emission goals that ultimately would be mandatory and have penalties. So my second point for today is you may well want to consider this issue of EUI and whether that's a place that the state should go in terms of mandatory regulation. That's not what the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022 does. That's what the MDE regulations have proposed to do. Third quick point, the regulation of EUI is almost certainly preempted by federal law. literally had a case in California, Berkeley case involving the Restaurant Association. Federal Appeals Court reaffirmed it 2 weeks ago. There is a federal act that expressly provides for energy regulation, including washers, dryers, hot water heaters, appliances. Very clear. Again, the General Assembly was given this advice 2 years ago when it enacted the statute, which is why you did not, I suggest, enact mandatory EUI standards, but rather provided that they were going to be guidance to ultimate regulations. And my final point would be that we're not ready to enforce these laws yet, because for a building owner who is burdened by these laws to do this reporting, and the reporting started 24 days ago, started January 1, they needed to gather this data. They need to get it from their tenants. In a residential setting, we heard Mr. Bremen talk about how it takes a long time to gather it. In a commercial setting, the tenants don't have an obligation to provide it. Many of these statutes in other places in the country have been phased in over longer periods of time to allow for leases to expire and new leases to be entered into, so a landlord can provide that a tenant must give the data. Not only do you need energy data, you need the number of employees in the ship, number of computers. All of this is necessary inputs for Energy Star. So I'll leave at that point. I realize we've run long, but I respectfully suggest that this question of whether EUI should be regulatory, how far do you want to go with mandatory greenhouse gas regulations, is something that your joint committees may well want to look at, despite the fact that there's no legislation before you on this matter at this point this year. Thank you all.
Thank you all very much. Sorry for the crunch. Delegate Stein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two quick questions. First, for Tom. Tom, I think you touched on penalties, and I think we'd all agree that no one wants owners of covered buildings to be subject to penalties. Would you be willing to work with us and MDE to come up with what you would deem to be acceptable alternative compliance penalties?
Absolutely, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, to be honest. It's not so much the amount of the penalty, it's the alternative compliance options that determine how often they apply, which is important as well.
Granted, I think both cases. Sure, that makes sense. And my second question is for Brian. Would you be able to provide the committees with estimates of what just the marginal costs associated with BEPS between now and 2040 would be?
Yeah, I can ask our consultants to take a look at that. So again, Stephen Winters did the cost estimate for DC BEPS compliance, Montgomery and Maryland BEPS compliance. For Maryland, they started with multifamily case study 2, because that was really the most analogous to what they looked at in DC. So there's still their contract with us isn't yet complete, but we'll potentially look at adding that and hopefully get that back to you all as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, this be from you, Mr. Capelone. Good to see you again. Maybe as a former DOJ lawyer, I am interested in this preemption issue. Can you send me some material, whether it's a California case or any legal analysis of that? I had not sure I've heard that argument before.
It'd be my pleasure. Thank you.
Delegate Foley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I apologize, but I just want to ask the question because I saw a small portion of this, but I didn't see several references to immersion and stoves.
And I thought that those were exempt from these standards. Isn't that so?
So again, in terms of what the consultants recommended, it's going to be on an individual basis and how you hit the site EUI targets. So while it may be exempt, that may be one of the measures that when you're getting an engineer's scope of work, they actually recommend for you to be able to hit the target. And there may be other ways that you may not even be able to hit the target without doing that conversion, particularly because the state proposed regs don't allow for things like on-site solar and renewable energy credits.
I guess I want to play lawyer for one moment and just clarify that there's not an express exemption or protection for your stoves or anybody's stoves. What there was, remember the Climate Solutions Act 2022 did a lot of things. One of the other things it did was require the Department of Labor to propose an all-electric building code. They have not provided the all-electric building code. So the answer to that question is unknown at this time, but the quick answer is as you just heard, there's no way to hit the EUI number that is proposed by having gas in a multifamily building. Just not possible. So there's not going to be gas in multifamily residential buildings.
Mr. Chairman, I know you're in a hurry, but I think Delegate, you're referring to the exemption for commercial kitchens. So the emissions, there is a provision that emissions from commercial kitchens and buildings are not counted towards the overall emissions of the building itself. That doesn't apply to other types of stoves.
Okay, well, thank you. I then misunderstood what was said in the earlier briefings.
Thank you, Delegate Foley.
Thank you.
Senator Hester.
I have a question, which I'd like to have follow up with offline, but I'm trying to understand how the differences between what MDE is saying, the Brattle Group report, and your numbers. Like, there's got to be assumptions in those various studies. And so I'd love to sit down with somebody who can actually help me understand why the numbers are so different.
Isn't that so? Okay, I do not see any other questions. Mr. Chairman, you have something to say?
No questions. Just first of all, I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank Chair Corman and the committee for hosting us. I think this is a hugely important topic, and I think it was worthwhile to spend a couple of hours on it. That said, for the members of the Senate, we're going to have bill hearings starting at 2 p.m. And we've got some hot bills with a lot of witnesses, so be there at 2 p.m.
And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.